On March 12, 2004, police in Fresno, California responded to what at first seemed like a typical custody dispute at the Wesson family home. Two women were claiming that their children were being illegally held in the home by their uncle, 57-year-old Marcus Wesson, and they had gone there that day to get them back. But things quickly turned hostile. Family members on both sides of the dispute were outside arguing, yelling, and during all of the chaos, as police were trying to figure out the best way to handle the situation, no one noticed that Marcus Wesson had silently slipped back into his home. And by the time his absence was finally noticed, it was too late. Marcus had already done the unthinkable, and 9 members of the Wesson clan lost their lives that day. As word of the tragedy started to spread, police and the public started to dig into the Wessons' past, and a mountain of dark and disturbing family secrets would come to light. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sommer Sanchez, and here on this channel we talk about crimes, cults, and heinous history. So if that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss an upload. Today we're talking about Marcus Wesson and how he used terror, manipulation, and really bizarre beliefs to control his family and turn them into a cult. Marcus Wesson was born on August 22nd, 1946, and he grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. He was the oldest of 4 children, and his parents were Carrie and Benjamin Wesson. His mother, Carrie, was extremely religious. She was described as a religious fanatic. She was a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and we've talked about the Seventh-day Adventists before on this channel in the Strong City cult that I did a few months ago, but the Seventh-day Adventists are known to be a very strict group. This is a fundamentalist form of Christianity, tons of rules. David Koresh and the Branch Davidians were an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists, and their beliefs are said to be so strict and so rigid, the church has so much control over people's lives that many people consider the church itself a cult. Carrie would conduct Bible studies with her kids several times a week, and she would focus a lot on apocalyptic stuff. She would talk a lot about the end of the world and the second coming of Christ. The family also followed a strict vegetarian diet, which is something that many members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church do, and Carrie was a very strict disciplinarian. She would resort to screaming and beating her kids if they ever got out of line. She would use objects to beat her children. She used belts, extension cords. She would also use switches, which if you don't know what a switch is, it's a very thin, flimsy stick. It's essentially like a mini whip. And being hit with a switch is extremely painful. It stings. It leaves welts on the skin. And as bad as all of this sounds, Marcus's father, Ben, was even worse. First of all, Ben was an abusive alcoholic. He would go out to bars pretty much every night of the week. He would get very, very drunk. And when he would get drunk, he got very mean and aggressive, and he would oftentimes start bar fights with random people. And these were not little squabbles either. These were serious. There were times that Ben got seriously injured during one of these bar fights. One time he got in a fight with this guy, and the guy pulled a knife out and slashed Ben across the neck. And Marcus and his siblings remembered a stranger dropping their dad off at home later that night, and he was just covered in blood. The wound was like 7 inches long, and Ben was in really bad condition, but he did end up surviving that attack. But even after this near-death experience, Ben still did not change his ways. Once he was recovered, he was right back out at the bars every night, getting blackout drunk. Marcus remembers having to pick his dad up from the bars and motels on many occasions because he just couldn't function. And like I said, Ben was very abusive as well, and he would be very abusive towards his children when he was drunk. And not only was he physically abusive, but later in life, the children would allude to there being some sexual abuse in the home as well. Marcus and his siblings have never just flat out said that Ben sexually abused them, but one of his daughters has said that when Ben would come home super drunk, he would be very affectionate, like lots of hugging and kissing, and she would literally have to run away from him because he just wouldn't stop touching her. She would run up the stairs and hide, so I mean that definitely sounds like abuse. The family also struggled a lot financially. Ben never held down an actual job. He just worked like several odd jobs here and there. Carrie worked as a nurse, but her salary alone, it just didn't cut it. You know, they had 4 children to care for, and Ben was spending a lot of their money at the bar. By the time Marcus was 10, the family packed up and moved from Kansas City, Missouri to San Jose, California, and California is where the remainder of this case takes place. So this is Marcus's home life. He has a fanatically religious, abusive, controlling mother, and he's got a volatile, abusive, alcoholic father, and the family is really struggling to make ends meet. And on top of all the problems at home, Marcus also had a pretty rough start in school. When he was in primary elementary school, he was said to be extremely shy. He didn't really talk to anyone. People have described him as awkward, and he suffered from a pretty severe stutter, which is likely why he was more introverted and shy. You know, kids can be so cruel. He was probably afraid to speak in front of his peers because he knew he would be bullied. But as he grew up and he moved into his teenage years, things at school actually started to look up for Marcus. He lost the stutter, he became really involved in sports, specifically track and field, and he was actually a pretty good athlete. And Ben never went to one of Marcus's track meets, by the way. And this newfound talent for sports is probably what gave Marcus more self-confidence. He started talking to people, he started making friends, he was doing all of the typical teenage things. At this point in his life, he is still very much involved in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but he's starting to deviate from their teachings a little bit. He's starting to become fixated on the idea of polygamy, and he would tell his friends that he planned to have multiple wives one day. Keep in mind that he is a young teenager at this point in the story, and he's already fixated on the idea of having as many wives as possible. As far as I can tell, the Seventh-day Adventists don't believe in polygamy. The mainstream church, at least, is actually very much opposed to the idea, so this is a pretty massive deviation from the religion that he's been completely immersed in his entire life. So like I said, Marcus started making friends, and one of those friends was a boy named Gregory Bledsoe. Gregory and Marcus got to be very close. They would have sleepovers and stuff, and before long, Marcus's father started sexually abusing Gregory. Ben's abuse of Gregory started one day when he was just hanging out at Marcus's house. Ben started making comments about the size of Gregory's penis. He would say, "I bet your penis is really big. I can tell by the way it looks in your pants that you're a winner." And then at some point that evening, Ben cornered Gregory and he asked him if he, Ben, could perform oral sex on Gregory. Gregory immediately declined, of course, but Ben just kept asking and pressing the subject. And then he finally said, "Look, if you let me perform oral sex on you, I'll give you $50. And sadly, Greg did finally relent. And I'm not sure how many times this happened, but there was another time where Gregory was sleeping over at the Wesson home and he woke up to Ben hovering over him, attempting to pull down his pants. Gregory did escape this time though. He actually told Ben to stop and he said, "I don't ever want you to touch me again." And according to Gregory, that was the end of the abuse. After high school in 1966, Marcus joined the army and he served 2 years in the Vietnam War as an ambulance driver. He was honorably discharged 2 years later, and then he went back home to San Jose to live with his parents. And it was around the time that Marcus made it back home that his grandmother and 2 of his cousins, Patricia and 18-year-old Larry Morgan, moved in with Carrie and Ben. The grandmother had raised the 2 cousins, Larry and Patricia. I believe she had custody of them and she had recently fallen on hard times. And so Carrie and Ben had agreed to let the 3 of them move in. And not long after they moved in, Ben started having a full-on sexual relationship with his 18-year-old nephew, Larry. I actually don't know when the relationship started, but we know that Ben has a sexual attraction to young boys. And remember earlier when I talked about how Ben would make comments about the size of Gregory Bledsoe's penis? Well, on one of those occasions, Ben compared Gregory's penis size to Larry's. So it definitely seems like Ben had been molesting his nephew long before they moved in. But whatever the case, when Larry turned 18, Ben announced to the family that he and Larry were moving out so they could finally be together. And they got a house together in Los Angeles. But Carrie and Ben did not divorce. In fact, Carrie essentially acted like nothing had happened, like she didn't want to acknowledge what her husband had done. She didn't want to believe that her husband of over 20 years had left her for his own nephew. So she just didn't talk about it. And she just kind of held out a hope that Ben would eventually come back to her one day and they could just put the whole thing behind them. And just for the sake of closure on this part of the story, Ben does eventually go back to Carrie. But before that, he basically disappeared for like 10 years. He really didn't see his wife or his kids much for an entire decade. And then he eventually did return home to San Jose in the late 70s. Carrie took him back and they moved to Washington State together. So after Ben left the home to be with Larry in the late 60s, Marcus met a woman named Rosa Solorio. Rosa was a neighbor. She lived just a couple of houses down from Marcus's mother's house. One day, one of the other neighbors was acting really strange. They were kind of being weird and violent. And so Marcus and his sister walked over to Rosa's house to protect her, and that was it. They were pretty much a couple from that moment on. And this is the part of the case where Marcus's true colors start to come out. This is really when he starts to lay the foundation of what would later become the Wesson family cult. So Rosa was a single mother. She had 9 kids and she had recently split up from her husband, Mike. One day, Mike told the kids that he was going on a trip and he just didn't come back. And so she was struggling just to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Now, Rosa was much older than Marcus. She was 34 and he was in his early 20s when they met, but the age difference didn't really seem to bother either one of them, and they quickly became a couple. But Marcus actually had ulterior motives for entering into this relationship with Rosa, because Marcus Wesson was actually a pedophile, and now he had access to 9 young children. As far as we know, Marcus never molested any boys, but we do know that he molested several young girls. And Marcus's first known victim was Rosa's 8-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is a very significant person in this case because she actually goes on to become Marcus's wife. But before we talk about Elizabeth, we need to discuss how the family dynamic changed so dramatically when Marcus entered the picture. First of all, Marcus introduced Rosa and the kids to the Seventh-day Adventist religion. He would hold Bible study lessons in the house, and he would force the kids to sit through hours and hours of his religious ramblings every week. He also changed their diets to a strict vegetarian diet to match his. And if the kids ever misbehaved or did anything that Marcus didn't like, he would beat them. And you can see at this point that Marcus is behaving a lot like his mother. He's treating the kids just like his mother treated him. The religious fanaticism, the yelling, the beatings, the strict rules, it's like an exact replica of Carrie's parenting. But it only gets worse as this case progresses. Marcus would hit the children with belts, he would whip them with extension cords, and they would be beaten over the smallest infractions. And the children were not used to this type of discipline. Before Marcus showed up, Rosa would yell occasionally. She would sometimes throw things at her kids when they acted up, which isn't great, but it's nothing compared to what Marcus is now doing to the kids. And Marcus would encourage Rosa to be harder on her children. He would tell her that she needed to have a firmer hand and she needed to beat the children when they misbehaved. One of Rosa's kids was named Jesse, and Jesse did not like Marcus. He didn't like the fact that this 20-something-year-old guy had just shown up and taken over his family. And so Jesse, more than any of the other children, pushed back against Marcus, and this would result in Jesse receiving very severe beatings. There was one time that Marcus beat Jesse across the face with a belt, and when Jesse ran out of the house, Marcus chased him through the neighborhood. There was another time that Jesse challenged Marcus, and Marcus whipped him repeatedly on his back with an extension cord, and the abuse was so bad that some of the boys stopped showering in the locker rooms at school because they knew that the other kids would see the marks and the bruises on their bodies. And you're probably wondering why Rosa would let this random young guy come into her house and essentially take over and turn everything upside down. And the most likely answer to that question is that Rosa was just so desperate for help from anyone at that point in her life that she just allowed Marcus to come in and do whatever he wanted to do. Before she met Marcus, she was all alone. Her husband, the father of her 9 kids, had just up and left. She had no job, no one to help her to raise the children. And then Marcus comes in, he takes control, which then takes some of the burden off of her. He's giving her attention. He's introducing her and the family to religion. He helped her to get on welfare, so now there's some money coming in. And so Marcus was allowed to just come in and run that household however he wanted to. Marcus didn't have a job at this point. The family was surviving solely on welfare benefits. And so Marcus would resort to stealing things. He would steal from grocery stores, from hardware stores, and he would even take the kids with him sometimes when he would do this. He would have the kids keep an eye on the employees while he grabbed whatever they needed. But as bad as all of this is, we now need to talk about the sexual abuse that was happening in the home. So like I said, Rosa's 8-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, caught Marcus's eye pretty much from the moment he stepped foot in the house, and he immediately started grooming her. He would make sure to pay extra attention to Elizabeth. He would shower her in compliments. He would go out of his way to make her feel special, which was a big deal for Elizabeth. You know, she didn't have a male role model in her life. Her dad had walked out, and she liked feeling special. And then one night, Marcus took Elizabeth outside and performed a wedding ceremony, complete with an officiant and everything. Marcus had asked one of his brothers to come by the house and officiate a wedding ceremony between him and his girlfriend's 9-year-old daughter. Marcus pulled out a Bible. He placed Elizabeth's hand on top of it, and then he covered her hand with his. Then the brother made them repeat wedding vows and everything. You know, Elizabeth, do you take Marcus to be your lawfully wedded husband? And Elizabeth has said that in her 9-year-old brain, she thought this was a game. She thought they were playing house. But she could tell that Marcus was very serious because for the next several months, he would repeatedly tell Elizabeth that in the eyes of God, she was actually his wife. He told her that they would have a legal ceremony one day when she got older, but for now, they were married in the eyes of God because they swore over the Bible. So eventually, Elizabeth really did start to consider herself Marcus's wife, and Marcus became very jealous and controlling over Elizabeth. When Elizabeth would do the typical things that 9-year-olds do, like go outside and play with her friends or go to sleepovers, Marcus would get extremely jealous and manipulative. When she would return home, he would act very cold towards her, and he would just use Elizabeth's desire for love and attention from a male role model to his advantage. And he would tell Elizabeth that she wasn't acting like his wife, and he would say, "That's it, we're not married anymore." And this would crush Elizabeth because above anything else at this point, she just wanted to make Marcus happy. So she would literally beg this 20-something-year-old man to take her back. She would be sobbing and saying, "No, I am your wife. Please say I'm your wife." And after watching this child beg and plead with him, he would finally say, "Okay, you can still be my wife." He was just so insanely manipulative. And this pattern would continue until Marcus knew that Elizabeth would do anything to keep him, and he could now get her to do whatever sick and twisted thing he wanted her to do. But then something happened in 1971 that sort of confused Elizabeth. Rosa, her mother, announced that she was pregnant with Marcus's baby. Rosa went on to have a son that she and Marcus named Adair. This was the only child that Marcus and Rosa had together. But as confusing as this was for Elizabeth, she has said that she didn't let the birth of Adair bother her because she knew that Marcus would never marry her mother because he was already married to her. Can you imagine these thoughts going through the mind of an elementary school aged kid? After the birth of his and Rosa's child Adair, Marcus started to sexually abuse Elizabeth. It's not known if he sexually abused any of the other children in the house. We only have Elizabeth's account, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot more to this story. So the house that they were living in had 4 bedrooms. They had the main bedroom, which was Rosa's room, and then there were 3 more rooms that the 9 children shared. And Marcus had built bunk beds for each of the 3 bedrooms. Elizabeth had the bottom bunk in a room that she shared with a couple of her sisters, and Marcus actually didn't sleep with Rosa. He slept on the bottom bunk in a room with some of the boys. And at night, once everyone was asleep, Marcus would sneak into Elizabeth's room and climb into her bed. Other times, Elizabeth would sneak out of her bed and climb into Marcus's bed, and Marcus would molest her. It started by Marcus feeling under her shirt and inside of her shorts, and then it slowly progressed from there. And this went on for years. And now we are jumping ahead a couple of years. It is now 1973. Elizabeth is now 14 years old, and Marcus is 27. Marcus still has the family under his control. He is still beating the children. He is still enforcing very strict rules, and he has continued and escalated the sexual abuse of Elizabeth. He's still sneaking into her room every night and molesting her, and we don't know exactly how far the abuse has gone up to this point, but we do know that things seriously escalated when Elizabeth turned 14. A few days before Christmas 1973, Elizabeth was just in the kitchen washing dishes when Marcus got down on one knee and asked her to marry him for real, like a real legal marriage. Elizabeth said yes, and according to her, after he proposed, this is when they had sex for the first time. Now, I am saying that they had sex for the first time, but just to be clear, I know that this is sexual abuse. This is rape because Elizabeth is a child, but I'm saying they had sex because in Elizabeth's mind, she believes that she is consenting, but she can't. She's 14. And just a few months after Marcus proposed, Elizabeth found out that she was pregnant. Elizabeth never came out and told her mother or any of her siblings that she was pregnant, but she was starting to show, and she knew that they knew. I don't know much about Rosa's reaction to the pregnancy or the proposal, but she did give her permission for Marcus and Elizabeth to get married. But since Elizabeth was only 14 years old, they couldn't just go down to the courthouse and get married. There were steps that they had to take to get a marriage license. First, they needed Rosa to consent, which she already did, and they also had to go to counseling sessions and get the approval of a counselor before they could get a marriage license. And unfortunately, the court counselor signed off on the marriage. Don't ask me why a counselor would sign off on something like this, but unfortunately, that's what happened. So by the time Elizabeth was 5 months pregnant with their first child, she and Marcus were married. He was 27 and she was in the 9th grade. Around this time, Marcus and Elizabeth moved out of Rosa's house and they moved into Marcus's mother's house. And in 1974, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby boy that they named Dorian. And Dorian was just the first of 11 kids that Elizabeth and Marcus would go on to have. Marcus, Elizabeth, and Dorian eventually moved out of Carrie's house and they found their own place in San Jose. And once Marcus had Elizabeth and Dorian isolated, the control and the abuse just got worse. Pretty much all of the responsibilities fell on Elizabeth. Marcus wasn't helping with anything. Not only was she taking care of a newborn, but she was also still going to school. At this point, Elizabeth was a sophomore in high school and she was desperately trying working to keep up with her studies so that she could graduate. If Elizabeth wasn't in school, she was tending to the baby, she was tending to the house, she was doing it all, and she was drowning. She just couldn't keep up. And to make matters worse, Marcus was constantly accusing Elizabeth of cheating on him with someone from her school. As soon as she came home from school, Marcus would start grilling her about who she had spoken to that day. He would ask her if she talked to any of the boys at school. Did they try to talk to her? And Elizabeth would always say, no, I didn't talk to anyone at school. I love you. I don't want to talk to anyone else. But Marcus wouldn't believe her, and he would ignore Elizabeth for days at a time. He would just give her the silent treatment literally for days. This is just like what he had been doing to her for years, ever since he performed that wedding ceremony when Elizabeth was 9. He would manipulate her until he had her crying and begging him for forgiveness, and she hadn't done anything wrong. Marcus was all about head games, and it was only going to get worse as the years went on. On one occasion, Elizabeth and Marcus were just sitting in their house, just hanging out, and out of nowhere, Marcus looked at Elizabeth and he said, I know you're having adulterous thoughts. Elizabeth promised Marcus that she was not having adulterous thoughts, but this time, instead of just giving her the silent treatment like he normally did, he kicked her out of the house. He wouldn't let her take Dorian with her. He wouldn't let her pack any bags or anything. He just forced her out of the house, like right there on the spot. And it just happened to be pouring down rain at the time. So Elizabeth was now forced to walk 5 miles to her mother's house in the dark, in the pouring rain, without her son or any of her belongings, all because Marcus thought she was thinking about another man. Marcus did show up at Rose's house later that night to get Elizabeth, but of course he didn't apologize for kicking out his 15-year-old wife in the pouring rain. All he said was, let's go home, and so they did. Marcus wouldn't even let Elizabeth have female friends. He didn't even like it when she spoke to her sisters. Pretty much the only woman she was allowed to talk to was her mom. And if Marcus ever had one of his guy friends over and one of them dared to speak to Elizabeth without his permission, he would take it out on her. He would give her the silent treatment for days. Sometimes he wouldn't speak to her for an entire week, all because one of his friends spoke to her. So Elizabeth was very isolated and she felt totally alone, which is exactly what Marcus wanted. He wanted her to feel as vulnerable as possible so she would rely solely on him. And Marcus would describe in brutal detail what he would do to Elizabeth if she ever left him for another man. He told her that first he would cut off her legs so she couldn't run away. Then he would chop off her arms so she could never touch anyone again. And then he would cut off both of her breasts and then mutilate her vagina so she could never have sex. But he said he would be very careful not to actually kill her, so she would have to live and suffer life being completely disfigured and no one would ever want her. And by the late 70s, Elizabeth had 4 kids and she was pregnant with her 5th child. After the birth of Dorian, she just kept getting pregnant over and over again, which just made her feel even more dependent on Marcus. So at this point in the story, they have Dorian, Adrian, Kiani, Sabrina, and Elizabeth is now pregnant with baby number 5. Marcus's goal was 12. He wanted to have 12 kids. And of course, Marcus was very physically abusive with the children, and it started from the time they were newborns. The only time the children were ever allowed to cry is if they were hungry or they needed a diaper change. Other than that, it wasn't allowed. Marcus believed that it was important to train them as babies not to cry. So if they did cry at a time that Marcus didn't see as appropriate, he would hit them. He would hit his newborn babies if they cried. The children were never allowed to go to public school because, of course, that was evil. Instead, they were homeschooled by him. Marcus closely monitored everything the children ate. They had to follow a very strict diet, and they never had enough to eat, so the kids were always very skinny. Marcus didn't let them go outside and play either. They weren't allowed to express themselves. They were never allowed to just be kids. And since Marcus kept Elizabeth and the kids so isolated from the rest of the world, the abuse went mostly unnoticed. When their oldest child, Dorian, was 3, Marcus injured him so badly that they had to take him to the emergency room. The injuries to Dorian's body set off alarm bells, and the nurses reported it to CPS, or Child Protective Services, but this went nowhere. As a matter of fact, CPS would be called on the Wessons multiple times throughout the years, and somehow Marcus always managed to wiggle his way out of trouble. Marcus was like most other cult leaders. He could be very charming, he was very convincing, and even when he was angry, he would keep this like very calm, collected, almost creepy demeanor. And so if the authorities ever got involved, Marcus would always be ready with some story to explain everything away. There was one occasion where the cops showed up at their home for something totally unrelated to the children. I think that they were there asking for one of Elizabeth's siblings, and the police were outside knocking on the door for a pretty long time while Marcus was trying to figure out what to do inside because he was in a panic because he thought they were there for them. The police could hear their voices inside the house, and so they knew that someone was home. home, but they weren't getting an answer. So by the time Marcus finally opened the door, the police were pretty suspicious and they asked if they could come in and take a look around the house. Surprisingly, Marcus did agree to let them look around, and they found the children hiding in a closet, completely terrified, very skinny. The police were like, why are these kids hidden in a closet? Like, what's going on? But of course, Marcus had a story ready. He said that since they were in a dangerous neighborhood, he had taught the kids to duck or to hide if there was anything suspicious going on. And so when they saw police at the door, they got nervous and they hid. So this ended up going nowhere. And this type of thing would happen anytime Marcus was questioned. He always had a way of explaining everything away. If Marcus ever felt like people were looking at him suspiciously or asking too many questions, he would just up and move the family somewhere else. At one point, he moved the entire family to the Santa Cruz Mountains, and they lived in an old school bus that Marcus had converted to an RV. And living in seclusion in the mountains allowed Marcus to control and abuse his family without anyone even knowing that they existed. Now, throughout their entire marriage, Marcus has consistently been pestering Elizabeth about adding a second wife to their family. Remember that Marcus is fixated on this idea of living a polygamous lifestyle, and he was not giving up on the dream. Elizabeth was totally against the idea of adding a second wife to the family. She didn't want Marcus to have a relationship with anyone else. But of course, one way or another, Marcus always gets his way. And one day in 1978, Marcus introduced Elizabeth to a 19-year-old girl named Ilabelle Lee, or Illabelle Lee. I'm actually not sure how it's pronounced. Marcus had met Ilabelle at church. She had recently moved to the area from Tennessee because her parents had kicked her out for getting pregnant out of wedlock. And so one day at church, Marcus spotted this vulnerable, pregnant young 19-year-old. And of course, he immediately introduced himself and offered to help her. He befriended her. He played the role of the sweet, caring, good listener. He even introduced Elizabeth to Ilabelle, and the two of them actually became friends. She would come over for dinner. They would get Ilabelle's daughter and their kids together for play dates and stuff. And several times a month, Marcus would go over to Ilabelle's apartment for Bible study. By the end of 1979, Marcus and Ilabelle were having a full-on affair. They would get together at Ilabelle's house for their Bible study sessions, and they would become intimate. And of course, Elizabeth didn't know anything about the affair. She truly thought of Ilabelle as a good friend at this point. And remember, Marcus didn't allow Elizabeth to have any friends, so she had been really happy that Ilabelle came along. You know, they would get together, they would cook, they would exchange recipes and stuff. They would let the kids play together. Ilabelle and her daughter became really close with the Wesson family. As this secret affair is happening in the background, Marcus is pitching the idea of bringing Ilabelle in as the second wife that he'd always wanted. He would ask Elizabeth questions like, you know, what do you think of Ilabelle? Do you think she would be a good fit for our family? And Elizabeth is still totally against the idea of sharing her husband, but Marcus told her that this wouldn't be an instant change for the family because he would make Ilabelle go through a trial period for 7 years. She would have to prove herself worthy of becoming his second wife for 7 years before she would be allowed in officially. So after several months of begging, Elizabeth finally gave in. But she did set some ground rules. She said that Marcus and Ilabelle were not allowed to have sex. Marcus agreed to those terms, but of course, he didn't live up to his end of the deal completely. He had already been intimate with Ilabelle many times before this point, and he got around this whole no sex rule by only engaging in oral sex with Ilabelle. And I guess in his mind, oral sex didn't count as actual sex. I don't know. But one day, Elizabeth walked in on Marcus and Ilabelle engaging in some sort of sex act, and that caused a lot of issues between Elizabeth and Marcus. And it also pretty much destroyed the relationship between Elizabeth and Ilabelle. As time went on, Ilabelle didn't see any real commitment from Marcus. He still referred to her as his mistress, not his second wife. And at one point, he asked her to become Elizabeth's handmaiden, like some sort of servant or something, I don't know. But it just all confirmed to Ilabelle that she would always be second best. Marcus would never love her like he loved Elizabeth. So she ended the relationship and she left town. And while all of this drama has been going on with Elizabeth and Ilabelle and Marcus, Elizabeth had given birth to 4 more children. Between the years of 1978 and 1982, the time when Ilabelle was in the picture, she gave birth to 4 more kids, bringing their total at this point up to 8. So now there is Dorian, Adrian, Kiani, Sabrina, Stefan, who sadly died at birth due to complications with the umbilical cord, Almay, Donovan, who died at 6 months old from spinal meningitis, and now Marcus Jr. Elizabeth was only 23 years old at this point, and she already had 8 kids. So that's like 1 child per year since she was 15. People who knew the family around this time said that Marcus started becoming even more extreme in his views, and he started acting really bizarre. Marcus was still enforcing a strict vegetarian diet on his family, but he was now allowed to eat meat. Elizabeth and the kids mainly ate like beans, oatmeal, rice, peanut butter, things like that. And Marcus was now able to eat whatever he wanted. There were times when Marcus would go and get himself fast food, but the children weren't allowed to have any. And the children were seen on several occasions rummaging through dumpsters behind restaurants and grocery stores because they just had nothing to eat at all. Marcus was also taking an interest in lots of other religions, and he even started to become interested in some cult leaders, like David Berg, the leader of the Children of God cult. He would take bits and pieces of several different religions and cults, and he just kind of like wove them into his Seventh-day Adventist beliefs. And so he created his own form of religion, which eventually led to him declaring himself a god. And you'll see later in the case that David Koresh and the Branch Davidians end up having a huge impact on Marcus's beliefs as well. Marcus would hold these really intense Bible study sessions at home twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening. And the children were not allowed to speak. They couldn't use the bathroom. They couldn't even make a sound while Marcus was lecturing. They weren't even allowed to cough. If they were sick, they would have to hold in their cough while he was lecturing, and if they couldn't hold it in, they would be beaten. We all know what it's like to hold in a cough. It's very uncomfortable and it's almost impossible at times, and these kids would have to hold it in for hours while Marcus lectured because they knew they would be in so much trouble. Elizabeth would sit near the youngest kids to make sure that they didn't fall asleep during Marcus's evening sermons, and Marcus would deliberately hold the evening Bible studies really late at night sometimes just to test the kids. The children weren't even allowed to get sick. If they ever got sick, Marcus would insist that they were faking, and then he wouldn't allow Elizabeth to give them medicine or take them to the doctor. And if they had like a stomach virus or something, Marcus would accuse them of sneaking non-vegetarian food, and that was the reason they were sick. And then he would beat them. And Marcus had a system when it came to beating his children. He had a designated room that was like the punishment room. When the kids did anything that he deemed out of line, which was literally nothing, by the way, these kids did absolutely nothing wrong. They never misbehaved because they were terrified of their father. But when Marcus created some imaginary offense in his mind, he would tell the kids to go in the room, the punishment room, and they were to stand there with their backs against the wall and just wait for him. Marcus would leave them in the room for a while just to add like another layer of anxiety, and then he would come in, usually holding some sort of object to hit the kids with, and then he would just proceed to go down the line and beat his children. Sometimes the objects would be like broomsticks, he would use a belt, sometimes he used an extension cord, and he would even sometimes beat the boys with a metal pole. And sometimes he would make the children go outside and pick a heavy stick for him to use in the beatings. And if the kids made the mistake of bringing him one that he thought was too small, he would go outside and get one himself, but he would make sure that it was even bigger, and he would beat them even harder and longer. These beatings were absolutely brutal. There were times where Elizabeth truly worried that Marcus was going to kill the kids and she would have to intervene. He would even hand out like sentences, I guess is the best way to describe it. He would sentence the kids to several days worth of beatings, and it was up to them to remind Marcus to beat them 3 times per day. So for example, he would sentence one of the kids to 10 days worth of beatings, which meant that they would be beaten 3 times a day for 10 days. And it was the child's responsibility to remind Marcus that it was time for their beating. They were supposed to come to Marcus and say, "Can I have my spank now?" And if they forgot to remind him, they would get extra days added to their sentences. These kids had been beaten literally since birth, so they knew not to act up. The things that Marcus punished them for were just ridiculous. One of the children was severely beaten for eating an extra spoonful of peanut butter without permission.
He found out and ripped the cable wire out of the wall and had me stripped naked in 15-20 minutes straight, head to toe.
On another occasion, the oldest child, Dorian, had drawn his father a picture, just to be nice, but he made the horrible mistake of drawing this picture on a Saturday. Saturdays in the Seventh-day Adventist Church are their worship days. It's like what Sundays are for most other religions. And since Dorian had drawn his father this picture on a Saturday, he was punished. Marcus made Dorian take a shower, and then he forced him to stand there naked, soaking wet, while he hit him on the back of his ankles with a switch. And if Marcus ever noticed that the children were becoming too close, like they had too tight of a bond with one of the other children, he would do his best to break it up. He did not want the other children or Elizabeth depending on anyone else or loving anyone else but him. Dorian and Adrian, the two oldest children, had grown really close over the years, and so Marcus decided that he needed to put an end to that. So one day he forced Adrian to sit and watch while he beat Dorian with a metal pole. It was a test to see if Adrian would try to save his brother, which he didn't try to stop the beating. He knew what would happen if he did. He really wanted to say something to make him stop, but he knew that he would be beaten and it would most likely just make things worse for Dorian. But Marcus would just play these mind games to test the children to make sure that at the end of the day, they were only loyal to him. And as the years went on, Marcus's mind just started melting. He was just becoming more and more unhinged, and his religious beliefs were getting so far out there. By 1986, Elizabeth had given birth to their final 3 kids, Gypsy, Serafino, and Elizabeth, who they called Lise. So by the age of 27, she had had 11 kids, 9 of which were still living. And they also ended up taking in 7 of Elizabeth's sister's kids. Her sister Rosemary had gotten into some trouble with drugs and she had to go to jail for a little while. And so she sent 7 of her kids to go live with Elizabeth and Marcus. So now there are 16 kids total living in whatever cramped little place they had at the time. And the family moved around a lot. They lived in a giant army tent at one point. They lived in the mountains in a bus. They even lived on a large boat at one point. Marcus was constantly moving them around to either escape debt or to keep the family secluded so he could continue his reign of terror without anyone questioning him. And now we need to talk about the incest that was happening in the household. Marcus was sexually abusing his daughters, and just like with Elizabeth, the abuse started when each of the girls turned 8, and then he slowly escalated the abuse as they got older. He started off molesting them by touching them on their chest and private areas. Then over the course of a few years, the abuse moved on to oral sex. And Marcus would even force the girls to perform sex acts on each other as well. He referred to the abuse as loving, and he told the girls that what they were doing was necessary in order to ensure that they pleased their future husband, which was him. He was their future husband. Marcus started holding secret wedding ceremonies with some of the girls, exactly like he had done with Elizabeth when she was 9, and he would give each of the girls a band to wear to signify that they were spiritually married. Marcus was determined to fulfill his dream of having multiple wives, and when he couldn't find anyone on the outside to join their family, he decided to marry his daughters. And once this happened, the sexual abuse ramped up, and Marcus eventually started fully raping his daughters. He also made the girls call him baby instead of dad, and he told them they were not to tell anyone what was going on. So the girls didn't even talk to each other about it. This was like an unspoken thing in the Wesson home. And when Rosemary's daughters moved in, Marcus did the same thing to them. Rosemary's daughters, Ruby, Sophia, Brandy, and Rosie, were all abused by Marcus as well. And Ruby and Sophia are very significant in the tragedy that happens at the end of the case. And Marcus did the same thing to them. He brainwashed them, he abused them, he molested them, he married them, and he raped them. Except for Brandy. She was molested by Marcus, but luckily she managed to escape when she was 16, years before any of the other kids were able to escape. Marcus started keeping the boys and the girls separated from one another. The brothers were being forced to live separately from their sisters and cousins. And Marcus's explanation for doing this was that he was worried that as the kids got older, they might start to form sexual feelings for their siblings. I do believe that Marcus was actually worried about this just because obviously that's how his mind works. He's totally fine with incest. But I also think that he separated them because he didn't want the boys to know that he was sexually abusing the girls. I think he was afraid that if the boys found out, they would try to intervene. But since they were kept apart so often, the boys didn't see the sexual abuse happening. Then in 1990, the kids got a short break from the abuse when Marcus was locked up for welfare fraud. He had bought a boat and he tried to hide it from the government, like he didn't list it as an asset when he applied for welfare. The state found out, charges were brought against Marcus, and it was ruled that he had stolen at least $20,000 worth of welfare money over the years. He ended up spending a few months in jail, and this was probably the happiest time in the kids' lives. The beating stopped, they got to eat more than they ever had before. Elizabeth was allowing them to go outside and play and act like kids. They climbed trees, they played games, they actually for once got to act like kids without having to worry. Their health improved. They put on some much needed weight. Elizabeth even got her driver's license. She was 31 years old at this point, and she'd never had the opportunity to get her license, but she finally felt empowered enough to do it. But as soon as Marcus got out of prison, he was right back to terrorizing his family. As soon as he got out, he conducted interrogations of each of the kids, and he systematically handed out beatings to each and every one of them. And after Marcus was released from prison, his behavior became even more erratic. He was super paranoid. He had this really intense hatred for the government. He was convinced that the government was watching him. He would hear helicopters that weren't there. He would see suspicious cars following him on the road. On one occasion, he was driving down the road when he swore he heard a helicopter. So he swerved off the road, got out of his car, and hid behind a tree for 3 hours because he was convinced that the government had spies in the sky watching him. He would also make the boys go outside every night to check for surveillance equipment and wiretaps. He started telling the kids that the government was evil, that they were the enemy, and that one day they would come in and try to break up their family. And of course, Marcus's religious beliefs were just becoming more and more outrageous as well. He started believing that he himself was a god, and he would say that one day he would become thin and fit, and he would have blonde hair and blue eyes. I'm assuming to resemble Jesus, I don't know.
Did he think he was a deity of some sort?
Yes.
Definitely.
Oh, yeah.
He said that if you see Jesus Christ, if you see God, you see me.
In fact, he was God. That's just the way it was.
Then sometime in the late 90s, he became obsessed with vampires, and he worked that obsession into his religious doctrine as well. He said since Jesus had eternal life and his followers drank his blood, he was technically a vampire, and he asked his children to become vampires for the Lord. He later even bought 9 coffins from an antique shop, and he made the children sleep on top of them. And when David Koresh and the Branch Davidians had that standoff with police in Waco in 1993, Marcus was totally obsessed. He watched every bit of news coverage he could find. He even made the kids watch the news coverage.
As we mentioned at the top of this newscast, a fierce gun battle has led to a standoff between law officers and occult members of a religious compound outside of Waco this evening.
We have a team report on this developing story, so let's begin with Debbie Johnson, who is standing by live near Waco. Debbie?
Bob, what we have at this time are 4 dead federal agents, 1 dead cult member, and at least 14 people wounded. Probably the number of wounded will be higher than that. The cult is something called the Branch Davidians. They're an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists, and their compound is east of Waco, about 15 miles. There's about 75 members.
And of course, he was on David Koresh's side. He sympathized with him. He saw himself in David Koresh. He even called David Koresh a godly man. And he used the tragedy in Waco as proof to his family that the government truly was the real enemy. They couldn't be trusted. He told the children that one day the government would try to separate them, and if that happened, they would be forced to eat greasy McDonald's food and go to public school. And once they ate the evil McDonald's food and went to public school, their spirits would become contaminated and their souls would be lost. So Marcus devises a plan to ensure that the government never came between him and his family. If CPS or the police ever tried to take the kids, they were instructed to commit suicide. So the way this worked was the older kids would shoot the younger kids, and then they would then turn the gun on themselves. Marcus said that he wouldn't be the one to kill the kids because, for one thing, he might not even be home when the police showed up. So he would need to train some of the older kids to be his soldiers, and the soldiers would be the ones to shoot the younger children and then themselves. And if one of the children, for whatever reason, didn't have the opportunity to be killed when the rest of the family was killed, they were instructed to kill themselves as soon as they had the opportunity. He said that even if they were being taken away in a police car, they were to kick in the window and jump out of the moving car. Basically, as soon as they had the chance, they were to kill themselves as quickly as possible so their souls wouldn't be lost, their spirits wouldn't be contaminated, and they could then join the rest of their family in heaven or whatever place Marcus believed in at this point, because honestly, I just don't know. His beliefs are all over the place. So Marcus made some of the older kids his strong soldiers, and they would be responsible for shooting the younger kids before then killing themselves. And he told them to aim for the eye because it was the quickest and most effective way to kill someone. Everyone agreed to this plan, and now they had a suicide pact. Another twisted part of this plan was that Marcus was going to have even more children. He wanted to be like David Koresh and have more and more babies to add to his cult. He said that he needed to have more babies for the Lord. But Marcus thought that Elizabeth was too old to have any more kids. At this point, she was in her mid-30s, and Marcus wanted someone younger to make more babies with. So, of course, he enlists the help of his other wives. His daughters, his nieces would be the ones to carry the babies, but they would only be considered the surrogate mothers. They would be impregnated by Marcus, they would carry the baby, give birth to the baby, but then the baby, in the eyes of God, was considered to be Marcus and Elizabeth's child. The only purpose of the other girls was to serve as a surrogate. So in 1994, Marcus held a meeting with the girls in the family. He sat them down and he told them this idea. He said, God's people are becoming extinct. We need to preserve God's children. We need to have more children for the Lord. And each of the girls agreed, because they were brainwashed. And so they said they would go along with this plan. Marcus did tell Elizabeth about this plan, which she was totally against, but Marcus did what he always did, and he just kept talking and talking until he had also brainwashed her to believe that this was the right course of action. Elizabeth asked the girls if they really wanted to do this, and they said yes. So Elizabeth finally agreed to let her husband impregnate her daughters and nieces. Now, Marcus knew the rest of the family would start asking questions about the sudden influx of babies, especially since Marcus didn't allow the girls to leave the house or talk to anyone. So he told the girls to say that they had went to a sperm bank and they had all been artificially inseminated. This family that has no money was suddenly able to afford multiple rounds of artificial insemination. The first of the girls to get pregnant was his daughter, Kiani. In September of 1995, Kiani gave birth to a daughter that Marcus named Isla Belle. You know Isla Belle, after the mistress he had back in the 70s. In March of 1996, Marcus's niece Sophia gave birth to a son they named Jonathan. A few months later, his niece Ruby gave birth to a daughter named Aviv. Then in July 1999, his niece Rosie gave birth to a son named Ethan. In August of 2002, his daughter Sabrina gave birth to a son named Marshy. 1 month later, in September of 2002, his niece Rosie gave birth to a second child, a daughter named Sedona. And in February of 2003, his daughter Kiani gave birth to her second child, a daughter named Jiva. And Jiva's name was actually a combination of Jesus and vampire. So that is a total of 7 children that Marcus Wesson fathered with his own daughters and nieces. And Marcus's suicide pact was put to the test one day in 1999. In 1999, the family was living on a boat called the Sudan. It was this really big tugboat docked off of Tamales Bay. And one day, Elizabeth and Marcus were out and he had left his niece Sophia in charge. And the kids started to notice that there were a couple of white vans just kind of circling the area of the dock, and the vans had the word progressive painted on the sides. And of course, these were actually Progressive insurance vans, but the kids didn't know that. And so they started panicking, thinking that these were police vans or CPS, and they were coming to take them away. So Sophia decided that they should probably enact the suicide pact. So she grabbed the family gun, she loaded it, and she told the kids to prepare themselves. But just to be 100% sure that she was making the right decision, she told some of the other kids to get in the lifeboat and row to shore and use the payphone and call Marcus to get the go-ahead to enact the pact. So while they did that, Sophia and the other kids dressed the younger kids in nice clean clothes, they cleaned up around the boat, and they each wrote a short suicide note. Marcus ended up telling them do not go through with the pact. He said those are just insurance vans, it's not the cops. So thankfully no one got hurt that day. But when Marcus got home, he was so proud that the kids were actually willing to go through with the plan. He was just elated that they were so committed. And he even read through each of their suicide notes that night, and he cried because he was so proud. So like I said, thankfully this time the kids escaped the situation with their lives, but the next time something like this happens, the outcome would be so much different. And we are now approaching the tragic end of this story. So over the next couple of years, some of the girls actually turned against Marcus and they managed to escape the family. Like I mentioned earlier, Brandy, one of the nieces, she was the first one to leave. She left when she was 16. Then 2 of the other nieces, Ruby and Sophia, escaped. And then one of Elizabeth and Marcus's daughters, Gypsy, managed to also escape. Their escapes were not easy though, and on several occasions, Ruby, Sophia, and Gypsy were tricked or coerced into meeting with Marcus to talk, and it always ended with him essentially kidnapping them. When Sophia left, Marcus tricked her to get into his car just for a talk, and he ended up stabbing her in the chest. Thankfully, she survived the attack, and all 4 girls did manage to eventually truly escape. But Ruby and Sophia had children with Marcus that they were forced to leave behind. Brandy and Gypsy had never had any children with Marcus. They had both been molested by him for years, but neither of them ever got pregnant. But Ruby and Sophia did have children with Marcus. Ruby had a daughter, Aviv, and Sophia had a son named Jonathan. And like I said, they were forced to leave them behind. He wouldn't let them take their kids. So for the time being, Ruby and Sophia were forced to leave their children in the Wesson home. They spent the next few years creating their own lives outside of the cult, trying to get settled. And they knew that one day they wanted to attempt to get their children back. And then in 2004, Ruby and Sophia found out that Marcus was getting ready to move the family from California to Washington State. And they knew that if they didn't get their kids back right now, they would likely never see them again. So on March 12th, 2004, Ruby and Sophia invited several family members and friends over to Ruby's house. These family members and friends were not part of the cult, and they were called there that day to help Ruby and Sophia rescue their kids from the Wesson home. They gathered at Ruby's house and they devised a plan that they were going to go over to the Wesson's home. They were going to bring their family and friends there as backup to basically keep Marcus at bay so they could get their kids. But right before they were set to leave Ruby's house to head over to Marcus's house, Elizabeth just happened to stop by. She had just come by to visit her nieces, and she was really surprised when she walked in and all these other people were there. Now, Ruby and Sophia knew they couldn't let Elizabeth know about the plan because they knew that she would try to stop them. So they told her that they were having a barbecue that day, which explained why all the other people were there, and they needed to just run out and grab some supplies for the barbecue. They were like, we're gonna all run out to the grocery store. You stay here and just wait for us and we'll be right back. They asked another family member to stay behind and keep an eye on Elizabeth, just to make sure she didn't leave or try to interfere with what they were about to do. Then Ruby, Sophia, and the rest of the group all left and headed over to the Wesson home. At this point, Marcus had the family living in a small house in Fresno, California. This house was actually meant for commercial use. It had been a law firm before the family moved in, and they had been living there for about a year or so. But this mission to get the kids went horribly wrong. Pretty much from the very start, the situation escalated into a screaming match between Ruby and Sophia and their cousins and siblings who were still loyal to Marcus. They were preventing Ruby and Sophia from coming in and taking the kids. And Marcus was absolutely refusing to let the kids leave. He did not care how many people they brought as backup. He was not going to budge on the issue. So someone on Ruby and Sophia's side of the dispute called the police when things started to really get out of hand. And when they arrived, Marcus was standing in the front doorway to block the police from coming inside. And he told them that he was the biological father of both the kids in question and he had custody of them. But Ruby and Sophia came prepared that day. They had brought the birth certificates and it had them listed as the mothers and unknown listed where the father's name would be. So they had proof that those kids were theirs. So the cops were like, okay, Marcus, you need to hand over these kids. They have proof that these kids belong to them. And they told him that if he didn't go inside and get Jonathan and Aviv and hand them over to their mothers, they were going to call CPS. Marcus still just kept arguing. He said, they abandoned their children years ago. They left them in my care. Those kids don't even know these women. I'm not letting them leave. And so the fighting just continued. Everybody's out on the front yard just screaming. It's just chaos. People on both sides of the dispute were screaming. Ruby and Sophia were frantically pleading their case to the cops. And at some point, one of the family members called Elizabeth and told her what was going on. So now she knew what was happening. So she raced home and now she's mixed up in the fight. And during all of this chaos on the front lawn, Marcus saw his opportunity. He quietly slipped back into the house completely unnoticed and he walked into one of the back bedrooms where the children were. Earlier, when the fight had first broke out, he whispered something to Sabrina, Rosie, and Kiani. And while the others were fighting outside, the 3 of them had been slowly gathering the younger kids and ushering them into that back bedroom. Elizabeth was actually the first person that noticed that Marcus was no longer standing in the front door frame, and she immediately started to panic. She knew what he was capable of, especially if he felt threatened that the kids would be taken, and her mind immediately went to the suicide pact. So she walked into the house and down the hallway where she noticed that there was a table pushed against the back bedroom door. Elizabeth moved the table out of the way and she slowly opened the door, and inside the room she saw her 17-year-old daughter Lise standing facing the door with tears in her eyes, while Marcus was down on his knees with his arm around Lise and he had his head down as if he was praying. A minute later, Elizabeth ran screaming out of the house and she eventually collapsed on the front lawn. And this sent everyone into a panic. Ruby and Sophia knew all too well about the suicide pact, and they were certain that Marcus would order the murders of their kids if something didn't happen fast. So they're desperately telling the police that, he has a gun in there, the kids are in danger. So they ended up calling a SWAT team. The SWAT team showed up because at this point, this was a hostage situation. Marcus has the kids barricaded inside of a room and he isn't coming out. And after an hour-long standoff with Marcus refusing to come out, the SWAT team finally went inside and got him. When they found Marcus, he was covered in blood, and they, of course, knew this was not a good sign. Marcus did actually go without a fight. The police escorted him out of the house, and then they started looking for the children. And what they found in that back room was an absolute nightmare. They found, at first, what looked like a pile of blankets on the floor. But when they turned the lights on, they realized that what they were looking at was a pile of dead bodies. On top of the pile was 25-year-old Sabrina. Then under her was 17-year-old Lise. Then 13-month-old Jiva, 18-month-old Sedona, 19-month-old Marshy, 4-year-old Ethan, 8-year-old Ilabel, and the final two children found at the bottom of the pile were 7-year-olds Aviv and Jonathan. It's likely that Aviv and Jonathan had been the first two to be murdered since their mothers were the ones who had shown up that day to get them. Each of the victims had been shot in the eye with a .22 caliber handgun, and what makes this even more tragic is that Sophia had managed to grab Jonathan's hand at one point when the fight first broke out, but Rosie had snatched him away from her, and then she forced him into that back room. Sophia had been so close to finally rescuing her son. In the end, all 7 of the children that Marcus fathered with his daughters and nieces were murdered, along with Sabrina and Lise. This brought the death toll to 9, the worst mass murder ever committed in Fresno. Accounts would vary regarding hearing gunshots that day. Some people said that they heard 2 shots, some said they heard at least 5 shots, but the police said they didn't hear any gunshots at all. And this is a point of contention because a lot of people criticized the police response to the situation, saying that they were told the kids were in danger and Marcus had a gun and he had threatened to kill the kids in the past, and the police should have went in sooner. People were allegedly pleading with the police to go inside and rescue the kids well before Marcus had even slipped back inside the house. Neighbors and relatives who were present that day said that the gunshots could clearly be heard, so there was no way that the police didn't hear it. So this part of the story is a little unclear, and unfortunately we still don't know exactly what happened that day in the back room. There were no fingerprints found on the gun, but gunshot residue was found on Sabrina's hands, and some of her DNA was found on the gun. And based on the coroner's findings, the 7 kids had been shot before Sabrina and Lise. The most likely scenario is that when Marcus was seen whispering something to Sabrina, Rosie, and Kiani, it's thought that he told them to carry out the suicide pact while he distracted the cops and the other family members outside. The girls gathered up the kids, including Sabrina and Kiani's own children. They ushered them into the back bedroom, and Sabrina shot each of them in the eye. Elizabeth likely knew that when Marcus saw her standing in the doorway, he would want her to come inside the room so she could also be killed, but Elizabeth had turned and ran out of the house.
9 lives taken too soon. Exactly 20 years ago, one of the most unthinkable mass murders in Fresno took place at this home in central Fresno.
Time that he said that, if they're trying to take their kids, that he'll kill them. And he did.
Hey, these people are strange. Nobody's ever talked to him. When the father would come out there, he was like supervising. He was standing with his arms like this, or he'd be sitting down.
Something terrible. Sad.
Marcus was taken into custody, and he could actually be seen handcuffed, being escorted to the jail, mouthing the words, "I love you," to the media. Marcus was charged with 14 counts of rape and molestation and first-degree murder of all 9 victims. The trial was set to take place in Fresno, and so many people knew about the case already, and people were so afraid of Marcus Wesson that potential jurors had to be excused because they were too terrified to even be in the same room as him. The trial began on March 3rd, 2005, and even though the evidence pointed to someone other than Marcus actually carrying out the murders, based on what police found out about the suicide pact, the incest, the cult that Marcus had created within his family, they knew that Marcus was still the one ultimately responsible for all 9 deaths, even if he himself hadn't pulled the trigger. If it hadn't been for the years of brainwashing and abuse, no one would have died that day. Elizabeth was given immunity in exchange for her cooperation, and she and several other family members got on the stand and testified. At that point, though, many of them were still very afraid of Marcus, and he still had some of them under his control, at least to some extent, so they weren't as forthcoming as the prosecution had hoped. But it didn't matter because in the end, Marcus was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. Marcus Wesson is still alive and remains on death row at San Quentin Rehabilitation Center. He is now 77 years old. The house where the murders took place in Fresno was demolished in 2006, and over the years, many of the family members, even those who had remained loyal to Marcus throughout the trial, they realized the sick hold that he had over them, and they have done their best to, put their lives back together and just finally be happy for once. And Elizabeth divorced Marcus in May of 2010, and she has no contact with him. She ended up going to college and strengthening her relationship with her children. Many of the children went on to get proper educations, and they went on to college, and they have started their own families. There is an interview with Gypsy Wesson, who now goes by Evelyn, and it's available here on YouTube, and she just seems like such a great person, and I will leave a link to that interview down in the description box if you're interested. After this case broke, there was a lot of criticism of Elizabeth. Why didn't she do more to protect her kids? Why did she let Marcus do the things that he did? And that is fair, but I do think that it's important to remember that Elizabeth was Marcus's first victim. She was groomed and brainwashed by him just like the others had been, starting at the age of 8 years old. So is it fair to place some of the blame on her? I want to hear your opinions on that and just your opinions on this case in general. Tell me how you feel about it. I've covered several cults on this channel, and while each and every one of them is terrible, most of them don't end in mass murder. But yeah, let me know what you guys think, and I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.